At the breaking of dawn on September 13, 1942, Corporal Walter Burack found himself huddled in a foxhole, perched precariously on a verdant ridge in Guadalcanal. His gaze was fixed south, piercing the dense jungle. He hadn't closed his eyes in a grueling 36 hours, and the unrelenting tropical heat, promising yet another day of strength-sapping humidity, clung to his body. His rifle, a weighty burden, felt heavier with each tremor of his exhausted, adrenaline-fueled hands. The narrow ridge behind him, stretching perhaps 1,000 yards, gently ascended to a rise the Marines had christened Hill 123. It was little more than a coral outcropping, blanketed in kanai grass that swayed in the morning breeze, grass tall enough to conceal a man, or, as they all knew, thousands of men when the next wave inevitably arrived. Less than a mile beyond this hill lay Henderson Field, a crude dirt airstrip, barely 1,500 yards long, hacked from the jungle and swamp by Japanese laborers and completed by American engineers. This unassuming strip of red dirt and crushed coral, baking under the equatorial sun, was more precious than gold or oil. It was worth dying for. The Japanese desperately sought to reclaim it, dispatching 3,000 soldiers for the task. Burack was one of only 840 Marines determined to thwart them. The Marines holding this ridge belonged to two elite formations, the 1st Marine Raider Battalion and the 1st Parachute Battalion. They represented the pinnacle of Marine Corps fighting capability. The Raiders, conceived in February 1942 as a special operations unit, specialized in amphibious assaults and jungle combat. Every man was a volunteer, honed at Quantico and in Samoa in hand-to-hand combat, demolitions, and small unit tactics, lean, tough, and aggressive. The Para-Marines were even more exclusive, having completed both Marine infantry training and jump school. They had sustained heavy casualties securing Tulagi in August, leaving only about 200 of them to bolster Edson's raiders. Together, these 840 men were the vanguard of American forces in the Pacific. Yet, even elite training and aggressive spirit had their limits. They were weary, famished, and low on ammunition. The previous night, Japanese forces had assailed their positions in relentless waves. The Marines had been driven back twice, regrouped, and held on, barely. Now, as dawn broke on September 13, the light revealed what the darkness had obscured. The slopes below their position were strewn with hundreds of Japanese dead, contorted in grotesque postures. Some lay supine, others face down in the mud. Some had perished instantly from bullets or shrapnel, others had crawled away to bleed out in the grass. The air hung thick with the reek of blood and cordite, mingling with the scent of damp earth and the sweet decay of the jungle. Flies, in black, buzzing clouds, already swarmed, their drone audible even over the ceaseless chirping of insects and birds. Burack had never witnessed such a multitude of dead. He had faced combat before, seen men die, and taken lives himself, but this was different, this was wholesale slaughter. The slopes resembled photographs he had seen of the Western Front in the Great War, bodies everywhere, twisted, broken, abandoned where they fell. Some Marines moved among them, searching for wounded, salvaging weapons and ammunition. But Burack knew this was merely a prelude. The Japanese had tested them. The true assault was yet to come. The next 18 hours would determine the fate of Guadalcanal, and with it, the entire Pacific War. The key to understanding this turning point lies in the strategic brilliance of one man, whose unconventional leadership would forge a legend. The fundamental challenge was clear: Japan dominated the Pacific. Since December 1941, they had forged a vast empire from China to the Solomon Islands, vanquishing every Allied force they encountered. Their soldiers were seasoned, disciplined, and unwavering in their commitment to victory. America possessed one solitary advantage, a patch of ground that could reverse the tide: Henderson Field. This rudimentary airstrip on Guadalcanal had been seized by American Marines on August 7, 1942. From this base, American planes could strike Japanese supply lines, attack enemy outposts, and safeguard the vital sea lanes connecting the United States and Australia. The Japanese High Command fully grasped the significance of Henderson Field. Its loss meant losing the Solomon Islands. Losing the Solomon Islands meant the collapse of their defensive perimeter. And losing that perimeter would eventually lead to losing the entire war. Thus, they dispatched their finest troops to reclaim it. Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi, a 49-year-old career officer and graduate of the Imperial Japanese Army Academy, commanded the Japanese attack force. A veteran of campaigns in China and Borneo, he exuded confidence, experience, and an absolute certainty of success. His confidence was well-founded. His 35th Infantry Brigade was among the Imperial Army's elite units, seasoned in China where they had mastered traversing difficult terrain, executing night attacks, and overwhelming defenses with swift, brutal force. They were hardened, expert jungle fighters. Kawaguchi's strategy was elegant. 3 battalions, nearly 3,000 men, would approach the American perimeter from the south and east, navigating terrain the Americans deemed impassable, dense jungle, steep ravines, rivers, and swamps. This arduous march would take days, each man carrying his own food, ammunition, and weapons. No vehicles or supply lines could follow. But the Americans would never anticipate an attack from that direction. That was the advantage. The Japanese would strike under the cover of night, when American air power was neutralized, their pilots unable to see, their planes grounded. The engagement would be infantry against infantry, close-quarters combat in the darkness, the Japanese forte. They had trained extensively for night fighting, practicing infiltration tactics, expertly wielding darkness as a weapon. Kawaguchi intended to overwhelm the defenders with sheer speed and numbers. His 3 battalions would assault the American perimeter simultaneously from multiple directions. The primary thrust would come from the south, directly up the ridge towards Henderson Field. 2 diversionary attacks from the east and west would pin American forces, preventing reinforcements from reaching the main effort. Once the Japanese breached the ridge, they would push north to the airfield. The distance was less than a mile, moving swiftly in the dark, they could cover it in under an hour. By dawn, Henderson Field would be theirs. American aircraft would be destroyed on the ground, the defenders cut off, surrounded, forced to surrender or face annihilation. It was a sound plan, one that should have succeeded. Kawaguchi believed there were only 2,000 Americans on Guadalcanal. He was mistaken, though not by a significant margin. The American perimeter around Henderson Field was tenuously held. Marines were stretched thin across thousands of yards of coastline and jungle, with limited supplies, no reinforcements, and no retreat if the Japanese broke through. The weakest point in the American defense was a grassy ridge, running north to south, approximately a mile south of Henderson Field. It was narrow, exposed, and barely defended. Kawaguchi immediately identified it as the shortest route to the airfield. If his forces could seize that ridge and advance north, they would slice directly through the American perimeter and reach Henderson Field in under an hour. But another man had also recognized the ridge's critical importance, Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson. Edson, 45 years old, was a career Marine officer whose carrot-red hair earned him the moniker, Red Mike. He was not a large man, standing 5 feet 9 inches and weighing perhaps 160 pounds, but he was forged of Vermont granite. He had grown up in Chester, toiled on his family farm during summers, and learned to shoot hunting deer in the Green Mountains. He joined the Vermont National Guard in June 1916, then the Marine Corps in June 1917, receiving his commission as a second lieutenant in October 1917. He was sent to France with the 11th Marines during World War I but arrived too late for combat, a profound disappointment. After the war, he served in various posts, then attended flight school in 1922, earning his wings. However, Edson found his true calling in Nicaragua during the 1920s and 1930s. There, Marines battled bandits, conducting counterinsurgency operations in brutal jungle terrain. Edson volunteered for patrol duty, leading his men on extended patrols through the mountains, hunting bandit leaders, and ambushing rebel columns. It was dangerous, exhausting work, and Edson thrived on it. He earned his first Navy Cross in Nicaragua in 1936 for leading a patrol that ambushed a superior enemy force, personally killing several bandits and dislodging the rest from their prepared positions. He returned to Nicaragua for another tour in 1929, patrolling the Coco River region, learning to navigate jungle rivers, subsist on local food, and fight in close terrain where visibility was measured in feet. He earned the Nicaraguan Medal of Merit with Silver Star for his service. Those who served with him noted Edson's unparalleled ability to read terrain, instinctively understanding how ground influenced tactics, anticipating enemy approaches, and positioning defenses. He was quiet, composed under fire, and utterly relentless. He never yielded, never retreated unless explicitly ordered, and always led from the front. In the years preceding World War II, Edson served in China, observing Japanese military operations during their invasion. He meticulously studied their movements, attack methods, and use of terrain. This knowledge would prove invaluable on Guadalcanal. He had earned 2 Navy Crosses before the war even began. Edson commanded the 1st Marine Raider Battalion, an elite unit of specially trained Marines designed for amphibious raids and jungle warfare. They were tough, disciplined, and fiercely loyal to their commander. They called themselves Raiders, everyone else called them Edson's Raiders. On September 9, 1942, Edson conferred with Colonel Gerald Thomas, the operations officer for the 1st Marine Division. Studying maps of the American perimeter, Thomas inquired where Edson believed the Japanese would strike. Edson's finger traced the ridge south of Henderson Field. "Here," he stated, "this is where they'll come." Major General Alexander Vandegrift, the division commander, disagreed, expecting the Japanese to attack from the coast, as they had previously. The ridge appeared to be a quiet sector, and Vandegrift planned to rotate Edson's exhausted raiders there for rest. Thomas saw an opportunity, convincing Vandegrift that placing the raiders on the ridge would serve a dual purpose, providing a rest area and plugging a critical vulnerability in the defensive line. Vandegrift approved. On September 11, Edson moved his 840 Marines to the ridge. They were not there to rest. Edson knew better. He walked the entire length of the ridge, meticulously studying the terrain, identifying fields of fire, and planning fallback positions. His Marines grumbled, they were exhausted, having fought for weeks, longing for sleep, hot food, and a break from combat. Instead, Edson ordered them to dig fighting holes, string barbed wire, and prepare defensive positions. His Marines, with a mix of affection and exasperation, nicknamed him Mad Man Merritt, the morgue master, a testament to his uncanny ability to find trouble and draw them into it. On September 11 and 12, Japanese bombers attacked the ridge from high altitude. That same night, Japanese cruisers shelled it from offshore. The bombardment endured for hours, trees splintered, the ground trembled, and Marines huddled in their fighting holes, praying. When the shelling ceased, the night fell silent. Then the jungle erupted. At 2,100 hours on September 12, Japanese infantry emerged from the tree lines south of the ridge. They came in waves, screaming, firing rifles, and throwing grenades. The Marines opened fire, machine guns hammered, mortars thumped, and tracers illuminated the night sky. The Japanese struck the Marine forward positions hard, outnumbering the defenders 3-1. They pushed through the barbed wire, overrunning the first line of defense. Marines fell back, fighting as they withdrew. The Japanese pressed on. Edson had anticipated this. He had positioned his forces in depth, with pre-prepared fallback lines. As forward units retreated, they withdrew to designated positions closer to Hill 123. The Japanese pursued them into a killing zone. Marine artillery from the 11th Marines, positioned north of the ridge, fired, forward observers called in coordinates. Shells shrieked overhead, exploding among the advancing Japanese. The artillery fire was devastating, bodies flew, trees shattered, and the attack stalled. By dawn on September 13, the Japanese had retreated into the jungle to regroup, leaving behind over 200 dead. The Marines tallied their own losses, 40 killed, over 200 wounded. Casualties had reduced their effective strength to approximately 830 men. They had been pushed back, but they had not broken. Edson convened his company commanders, eating cold hash from a can as they squatted around him. He told them the unvarnished truth. They were testing, he said. Just testing. They'll be back. I want all positions improved. All wire lines paralleled, a hot meal for the men. Today, dig, wire up tight, get some sleep, we'll all need it. The Japanese will be back, and I want to surprise him. The Marines spent September 13th bolstering their defenses. They dug deeper fighting holes, repositioned machine guns, checked ammunition, and ate what food they had. They attempted to sleep, but most could not. They knew what was coming. Edson pulled his defensive line back 400 yards, consolidating his forces around Hill 123. He positioned 5 companies in a tight perimeter. Behind them, he placed a battery of 4 105mm howitzers from the 3rd Battalion, 11th Marines, under Lieutenant Colonel James Keating, their guns aimed to fire directly onto the ridge. Forward artillery observers moved to the front lines with radio equipment. Late in the afternoon, as the sun began to set over the jungle canopy to the west, casting long shadows across the ridge, Edson climbed onto a weathered wooden grenade box, stout and stamped with faded black United States Marines, that someone had left near his command post. He stood on it so his men could see him. His exhausted Marines gathered around him, emerging from their fighting holes, machine gun positions, and mortar pits. They were filthy, their uniforms caked with mud and coral dust, their faces gaunt from lack of sleep and food. Many bore bandages on arms, legs, and heads from wounds sustained the previous night. They reeked of sweat, gun oil, and fear. They looked at their commander and waited. Edson met their gaze. He saw young men, most barely 20 years old, farm boys from Iowa, factory workers from Detroit, college kids from California. They had volunteered for the Raiders, trained harder than anyone, and proven themselves in combat. They had every right to be proud, but now they simply looked tired and scared, wondering if they would survive another night. Edson understood that feeling. He had experienced it in Nicaragua, in China, on Tulagi. Every combat leader feels it before a battle. The crucial difference was what one did with that fear. He spoke to them without shouting, his voice calm, matter-of-fact, as if discussing the weather. You men have done a great job, and I have just one more thing to ask of you. Hold out just one more night. I know we've been without sleep a long time. But we expect another attack from them tonight, and they may come through here. I have every reason to believe that we will have reliefs here for all of us in the morning. He paused, looking at the faces of his Marines. Some met his eyes, others looked at the ground. All listened. This was not a pep talk, not a patriotic speech about duty, honor, or the American way. This was simpler, one more night. That was all he asked. Just hold for one more night. They had already held for one night, they could do it again. Relief would come in the morning. He believed it. Whether it was true or not mattered less than his Marines believing him. The Marines looked at their commander, seeing the exhaustion in his face, the determination in his eyes, the absolute certainty in his bearing. Red Mike said hold, so they would hold. They had followed this man through hell before, they would follow him one more night. Some nodded. Others simply turned and returned to their positions. There was work to do, ammunition to distribute, fields of fire to clear, positions to improve. One more night. They could do one more night. As darkness fell on September 13th, the temperature dropped. Rain began to fall, lightly at first, then heavier, turning the ridge into mud. Visibility plummeted to a few yards. Marines crouched in their fighting holes, weapons ready, peering into the darkness. Every sound made them flinch, every shadow made them tense. At 1830 hours, Japanese destroyers offshore opened fire. The Marines heard them first, a distant rumble like thunder, then the shriek of shells overhead, that distinctive freight train sound that grew louder and louder until the world exploded. Shells screamed overhead and burst along the ridge. Each explosion was a physical blow, a concussion that rattled teeth and stole breath from lungs. Trees burst apart in showers of splinters. The ground shook so violently that Marines bounced in their fighting holes. Coral dust and dirt rained down. The barrage lasted 20 minutes that felt like 20 hours. Some shells landed directly in fighting holes, Marines vanished in eruptions of dirt and fire, their screams lost in the roar of explosions. Others were wounded by shrapnel, pieces of shell casing spinning through the air at supersonic speeds, tearing through flesh and bone. Corpsmen crawled from hole to hole during the barrage, dragging wounded men to cover, applying bandages with shaking hands as shells burst around them. When the naval bombardment ceased, the night fell silent again. The silence was worse than the explosions. In the quiet, Marines heard the ringing in their ears, the cries of wounded men, their own breathing too loud in the sudden calm. They gripped their rifles tighter. They stared into the darkness. They waited. Then the Japanese attacked. 3,000 men emerged from the jungle like ghosts materializing from the darkness. One moment, there was nothing but jungle sounds, insects, birds, the whisper of wind in the grass. The next, the tree line erupted with movement and noise. They came in human waves, one after another, screaming battle cries that echoed across the ridge, Banzai! Tenno Hika Banzai! Long live the Emperor! The sound was terrifying, thousands of voices raised in unison, a wall of noise meant to intimidate, paralyze, to break the will of defenders before the first shot was fired. But the Marines did not break. They opened fire. Machine guns hammered, spitting out 600 rounds per minute, red tracers reaching into the darkness. Rifles cracked in a steady rhythm as Marines fired, worked their bolts, fired again. The M1 Garand rifles gave the Marines a firepower the Japanese could not match, 8 rounds per clip, semi-automatic, fast and deadly. Mortars thumped, sending shells arcing into the darkness to explode among the charging Japanese. The noise was overwhelming, a continuous roar that drowned out thought. The Japanese struck the Marine lines like a tsunami. Rifle fire cracked and echoed. Machine guns roared without pause. Grenades exploded in bright flashes. Men screamed in rage, pain, and terror. Orders were shouted and lost in the cacophony. The ridge became a nightmare of fire and blood, lit by muzzle flashes and explosions, filled with smoke that burned eyes and throats. The Marines fired until their barrels glowed red-hot, burning their hands on the metal. They threw grenades until their arms ached, until their shoulders screamed with pain. When the Japanese closed in, they fought with bayonets and rifle butts, with entrenching tools and bare hands. The fighting was hand-to-hand, brutal, desperate. Men grappled in the mud, slipping, falling, stabbing with bayonets and knives. There was no time to think, no time to be afraid. There was only the enemy in front of you and the primal need to kill him before he killed you. Some fighting holes became scenes of savage close-quarters battle. Japanese soldiers leaped into Marine positions, and the fighting became personal, intimate, deadly. Men stabbed each other with bayonets, slashed with knives, clubbed each other with rifle butts and rocks. Bodies piled up in the fighting holes, American and Japanese mixed. Together, some wounded and dying, others already dead. The Japanese breached the Marine right flank, creating a 200-yard gap in the defensive line. Japanese infantry poured through the breach, surging toward Hill 123. For a moment, it appeared the line would collapse. If the Japanese reached the summit of Hill 123, they would have a clear path to Henderson Field, and the battle, possibly the entire campaign, would be lost. Edson was omnipresent. He moved constantly along the line, never more than 20 yards from the front. He could have remained at his command post, directing the battle from cover, but that was not his way. He needed to witness events with his own eyes. He needed his Marines to see him, to know he was there, that he would not abandon them. He shouted orders over the roar of gunfire, his voice cutting through the noise, "Pull back to the secondary line. Get that machine gun repositioned. Bring up more ammunition." His commands were clear, precise, exactly what was needed at that moment. He moved from position to position, checking fields of fire, directing counterattacks, plugging gaps in the line. While other men hugged the ground, seeking cover from the hail of bullets and shrapnel, Edson stood upright, fully exposed to enemy fire, pointing, gesturing, commanding. It was insane, it should have killed him. Bullets cracked past his head, grenades exploded near his feet, shrapnel whistled through the air around him. He ignored it all. His Marines watched him and discovered courage they did not know they possessed. If Red Mike could stand in that hell without flinching, if he could walk through that storm of steel without fear, then so could they. A Marine forward observer, Private First Class Tom Watson, ran to the front lines with his radio. He was a battery clerk, not a trained observer, but he was all they had. Watson crouched in a fighting hole and called in artillery coordinates. His voice was calm, precise. He adjusted fire, walking the shells back and forth across the ridge in front of the Marine positions. The artillery fire was devastating. 105mm shells exploded among the charging Japanese, bodies flew. The attack staggered, but the Japanese kept coming. Another wave formed and charged. Watson adjusted fire again. More shells screamed in. More Japanese fell. The Marines in the fighting holes kept firing. Their ammunition was running low, some Marines were down to their last magazine. Edson recognized the crisis. He ordered his reserve company forward. Marines from companies B and C surged north, fixed bayonets, and counterattacked into the breach. They struck the Japanese flanks, driving them back off the ridge. The fighting was savage, Japanese and American soldiers battling face-to-face in the darkness, stabbing, shooting, killing. The counterattack succeeded, the breach closed, and the defensive line stabilized. Another wave of Japanese attacked from the left, attempting to flank the Marine positions, circling toward the Lunga River. Marine machine gunners swung their guns and fired into the advancing troops. The Japanese fell in piles but kept coming. The Marines exhausted their ammunition belts. They reloaded, fired again, ran out again. They scavenged ammunition from dead Marines and continued firing. A Japanese soldier made it all the way back to the Marine command post. He threw a grenade that exploded near Edson, shrapnel tore into the ground around him. Edson did not flinch. He drew his pistol and shot the man, then turned back to directing the defense as if nothing had happened. The Japanese attacks persisted through the night, wave after relentless wave. Each assault was repelled by artillery fire, machine gun fire, and rifle fire. The Marines refused to yield ground. Men fought until they collapsed from exhaustion, were pulled from the line, given water, and sent back in. There was no one else, every Marine on that ridge was in the fight. Around midnight, the rain ceased. The moon emerged, improving visibility. The Marines could see the Japanese forming for another attack. Artillery observers called in fire before the assault even began. Shells landed among the Japanese assembly area. The attack dissolved before it started. Bodies littered the slopes, the stench of death was overwhelming. At 0100 hours on September 14, the Japanese attempted one final assault, concentrating everything on Hill 123. If they could seize that hill, they could still win. 3 battalions charged up the ridge together. It was the largest assault of the night. The noise was deafening. The Marines on Hill 123 fired everything they had, rifles, machine guns, mortars, grenades. The artillery behind them fired directly into the charging troops. The howitzers were depressed to their minimum elevation, firing over open sights like giant shotguns. The shells exploded among the Japanese at point-blank range. The Japanese reached the Marine wire. They cut through it. They reached the fighting holes. Hand-to-hand combat erupted along the entire line. Marines fought with bayonets, entrenching tools, bare hands. Men fell on both sides. The fighting holes filled with bodies, blood mixing with mud and rain. The ridge became a slaughterhouse, but the Marines refused to break. Inch by inch, fighting hole by fighting hole, they held their positions. The Japanese could not break through. They could not advance. They could not overrun Hill 123. At 0230 hours, the Japanese attack faltered. At 0300 hours, it stopped. The Japanese withdrew into the jungle, leaving their dead behind. By dawn on September 14, the ridge was silent. Marines climbed out of their fighting holes and looked around. The slopes were covered with Japanese bodies. Some estimates placed the number at over 1,000. The exact count was impossible. Bodies were everywhere, some in piles where artillery had caught them in the open, others scattered across the ridge where they had fallen in close combat. The Marines had suffered 57 killed or missing, 232 wounded. Out of the 840 men who had deployed to the ridge, 289 became casualties. Some companies were down to 30 or 40 effectives. The 1st Parachute Battalion was so badly mauled it would be evacuated from Guadalcanal 4 days later, never to return. But they had successfully defended the ridge. Henderson Field was safe. The Japanese attack had failed. At 1305 hours, Major General Kawaguchi led the survivors of his brigade away from the ridge and deeper into the jungle. He had lost more than 800 men killed in the battle, with hundreds more wounded. His battalions were shattered, his plan a failure. The retreat was a nightmare. Kawaguchi's surviving troops had to march through jungle to reach friendly positions. They had consumed their last rations before the attack. They were starving, exhausted, carrying wounded comrades who screamed with every step. The jungle offered nothing but more suffering. Malaria and dysentery spread through the columns. Men too weak to walk were left behind with a single-hand grenade to end their suffering. As they marched, they began discarding equipment. First the heavy weapons, too exhausting to carry. Then the light weapons. Then their rifles. Helmets and packs littered the jungle trails behind them. By the time they reached safety 5 days later, only half still carried weapons. The Kuma Battalion got lost in the jungle and wandered for 3 weeks before finding Kawaguchi's position. Many died of starvation during that march. Others simply sat down beneath trees and never rose again. One Japanese officer later wrote that Guadalcanal was not the name of an island, it was the name of the graveyard of the Japanese army. The defeat at Edson's Ridge shattered Japanese confidence. For the first time in the Pacific War, they had thrown everything at an American position and been stopped cold. Their tactics had failed. Their superior numbers had not mattered. They had lost. The Japanese had no idea what had stopped them. They had fought American Marines before, they had usually won. But something was different at Edson's Ridge. The Americans fought with a ferocity and determination the Japanese had not encountered. They maintained positions that should have been overrun. They counterattacked when they should have retreated. They refused to break. From the Japanese perspective, the battle was inexplicable. They had superior numbers. They had attacked at night when American firepower was less effective. They had used infiltration tactics that had worked dozens of times before, but nothing had worked. Every assault had been stopped, every breakthrough had been sealed. By dawn, more than 800 dead Japanese soldiers lay on that ridge. And the Americans still defended it. Japanese intelligence officers questioned survivors in the following days. The reports were consistent, American defensive fire had been heavier than expected. Artillery had been devastatingly accurate. Marine infantry had refused to abandon positions even when flanked. Officers who had led previous successful operations in China and Malaya could not explain what had gone wrong. The tactics were sound. The execution was proper, but the result was catastrophic. Something fundamental had changed in how Americans fought. Tokyo would need to reconsider its entire assessment of enemy capabilities. General Vandegrift later stated that the Japanese assault on the ridge in September was the only time during the entire Guadalcanal campaign he had doubts about the outcome. If the Japanese had succeeded, the entire American position on Guadalcanal would have collapsed. The Marines would have been forced to evacuate or surrender. Japan would have regained control of the Solomon Islands. The momentum in the Pacific would have swung back to Japan. But the Japanese did not succeed. 840 Marines had defended a ridge against 3,000 attacking troops for 2 nights. They had done what everyone said was impossible. Edson had recognized that ridge as the critical terrain. He had convinced his superiors to defend it. He had positioned his forces perfectly. He had planned fallback lines that allowed his troops to withdraw without breaking. He had called in artillery with devastating effect. And when the crisis came, he had stood in the open under fire, rallying his Marines by sheer force of will. Kawaguchi's defeat at Edson's Ridge had strategic consequences far beyond Guadalcanal. Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo had been planning a major offensive in New Guinea. Japanese forces were within 30 miles of Port Moresby, the last Allied stronghold on the island. Capturing Port Moresby would give Japan control of New Guinea and threaten Australia itself. But the defeat at Guadalcanal forced a change in plan. Tokyo ordered the New Guinea offensive halted. All available troops and supplies were diverted to Guadalcanal to retake Henderson Field. The Japanese forces in New Guinea, so close to victory, were ordered to withdraw and wait. They never got another chance. The momentum was lost. The offensive died. New Guinea remained in Allied hands. The Japanese would try again to take Henderson Field. In late October 1942, they launched an even larger offensive with more troops, more artillery, and better planning. That attack also failed. The Americans held control. After that, Tokyo gave up on retaking Guadalcanal and began evacuating their remaining forces. By February 1943, the island of Guadalcanal was entirely in American hands. Historians later identified the Battle of Edson's Ridge as the turning point of the Guadalcanal campaign. Historian Richard Frank wrote that the Japanese never came closer to victory on the island itself than in September 1942, on a ridge thrusting up from the jungle just south of the critical airfield. If Kawaguchi had broken through, the outcome of the entire Pacific War might have been different. For his leadership during the battle, Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson was awarded the Medal of Honor. The citation praised his extraordinary heroism and conspicuous intrepidity above and beyond the call of duty. It noted that he had continuously exposed himself to hostile fire throughout the night and personally directed the defense of the reserve position against a fanatical foe of greatly superior numbers. By his astute leadership and gallant devotion to duty, he enabled his men, despite severe losses, to cling to their position on the vital ridge. Edson never sought recognition for what he did. He deflected praise to his Marines. When asked about the battle years later, he said simply that his men did what Marines do. They held the line when it mattered most. Private First Class Tom Watson, the battery clerk who had called in artillery fire during the crisis, was given a battlefield commission. He went from enlisted clerk to second lieutenant overnight. His accurate artillery direction had saved the Marine positions during the critical moment when the Japanese broke through. Officers who witnessed his actions said he had fought like a veteran forward observer, despite having no formal training. Watson had called in 32 separate fire missions during the critical hours between midnight and dawn. Some had been made with Japanese infantry less than 50 yards from his position. He had remained calm throughout, his radio transmissions clear and precise, even as grenades exploded nearby. Artillery officers said his target corrections were as accurate as those of veteran forward observers with years of training. The ridge itself was officially renamed Edson's Ridge in honor of the commander and his raiders. The Marines who fought there never called it anything else. To them, it would always be Edson's Ridge, the place where they held against impossible odds because their commander asked them for one more night. Edson went on to command the 1st Marine Regiment during the remainder of the Guadalcanal campaign. He led his regiment through brutal fighting along the Meticulously River and during the battle for Henderson Field in October. He was promoted to full colonel and later to brigadier general. After the war, he continued to serve, eventually retiring as a major general. He became the first commissioner of the Vermont State Police and later served as executive director of the National Rifle Association. As Vermont's first police commissioner, Edson organized a modern state law enforcement agency from scratch, applying military discipline and training standards to civilian policing. He established training programs, standardized procedures, and built a professional force that became a model for other states. At the National Rifle Association, he worked to expand marksmanship programs and firearms safety education. His leadership in both roles reflected the same attention to detail and organizational skill he had shown on Guadalcanal. On August 14, 1955, Merritt Edson died by suicide at his home in Washington, District of Columbia. He was 58 years old. The reasons were personal and complex, involving health issues and depression. He was buried in Arlington National Cemetery with full military honors. His legacy, however, lived on. At Marine Corps Recruit Depot, San Diego, every recruit undergoes a final 54-hour test called the Crucible. The last event is a brutal climb up a hill called the Reaper. At the top, recruits find a plaque with a quote from Edson's Medal of Honor citation. They read it, learn about the Battle of Edson's Ridge, and then receive their eagle, globe, and anchor emblem, becoming Marines. The message is clear: this is what Marines do. When the situation is desperate, when the odds are impossible, when everything depends on holding the line, Marines hold. Walter Burack, the corporal who had watched the dawn break on September 13 from his fighting hole, survived the battle. He continued fighting on Guadalcanal as a runner and messenger for Headquarters Company. On October 8, 1942, less than a month after Edson's Ridge, Walter Burack was killed in action. He was awarded the Navy Cross posthumously for his extraordinary heroism during the battle. The story of Edson's Ridge reveals how battles are truly won, not through advanced technology or superior resources, but through leadership that inspires ordinary men to do extraordinary things. The Marines on that ridge had less of everything than the Japanese: fewer men, less ammunition, less food, less rest. What they had was superior leadership, better defensive planning, and an absolute refusal to accept defeat. Edson had identified the critical terrain 5 days before the battle, positioned his forces perfectly, planned fallback lines that turned a potential rout into an orderly withdrawal, and integrated artillery support so effectively that every Japanese attack walked into a curtain of steel. When the crisis came, he stood in the open under fire, showing his Marines that their commander would never ask them to do something he would not do himself. The Marines on Edson's Ridge were not superhuman. They were exhausted, scared, hungry young men, most of them barely out of their teens. They were far from home, fighting in a jungle that was trying to kill them, facing an enemy that outnumbered them more than 3 to 1. They had every reason to retreat, to run, to surrender, but they refused. They held their positions because their commander told them to, and they trusted him enough to believe it mattered. 70 years after the battle, a memorial was erected on Guadalcanal at the site of Edson's Ridge. Local residents call the area Bloody Ridge, remembering the thousands who died there. The Solomon Islands government has worked to preserve the battlefield, clearing unexploded ordnance and protecting historical sites. Tour guides take visitors up the ridge, showing them the fighting positions, explaining the battle, pointing out where the Marines defended and where the Japanese attacked. The jungle has reclaimed most of the ridge. The fighting holes have filled in. The barbed wire has rusted away. Nature has covered the scars. But the shape of the ridge remains unchanged. It is still narrow, still grassy, still rising to that small hill the Marines called Hill 123. Standing on that ridge today, it is easy to understand why Edson identified it as the critical terrain. It is the natural avenue of approach to Henderson Field. Any attacking force would use that ridge, and any defending force that controlled it would control access to the airfield. Visitors can still trace the defensive lines Edson established. Depressions in the ground mark where fighting holes once protected Marines. The fields of fire remain clear, showing how Edson positioned his machine guns to create interlocking zones of death. The terrain itself tells the story of tactical genius meeting desperate courage. The American victory at Edson's Ridge changed the course of the Pacific War. It saved Henderson Field. It secured Guadalcanal. It forced Japan to divert resources from other campaigns. It broke Japanese confidence, and it proved that American forces could defeat Japanese forces in close combat. Every subsequent American victory in the Pacific built on the foundation laid at Edson's Ridge. The men who fought there never forgot it. Veterans' reunions brought them together decades later. They shared stories, remembered friends who did not come home, and honored the memory of Red Mike Edson. They spoke about the fear, the exhaustion, the desperation of those 2 nights. But they also spoke about the pride. They had been tested in the worst possible circumstances and passed that test. That was enough. The men who fought against America left the most honest record of its power. Battlescars brings you one of those stories every single day. If this one held you to the end, subscribe, tomorrow's story is already waiting. And your next one is right here.